Hello and welcome to our Voices in Montessori podcast, brought to you by the Green Springs Center for Lifelong Learning. I'm Tamara Sheasley Ballas, and in today's episode, I'm delighted to be talking with Dr. Catherine McTamaney about Montessori for the New Society, the Spiritual Development of the Educator. Catherine is a professor and the director of Department of Teaching and Learning at Vanderbilt University. She is also the author of several books on Montessori education and compassionate teaching, The Tao of Montessori, A Delicate Task, and Only Poets and Little Children, as well as Picasso in the Preschool. I want to share with you that several of these books are my personal favorites, and I'm absolutely delighted to have Catherine join us today. Welcome, Catherine. I'm so happy to have you here today. I feel like I'm getting to talk to somebody who really has shaped my own thinking in such a profound way through your books, and really excited to have you here.
Thank you. That's just what a kind welcome. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
So today we're going to talk about one of my absolute favorite topics, the spiritual preparation of the teacher. And my first question for you is, why is that important? People hear it all the time, right? And I think it sometimes gets glossed over in training. We focus on the materials. We're deep in it with philosophy. But what is it about the spiritual development and preparation of the teacher that is so important?
I think we can talk about it in a lot of different ways. I think we can talk about an emphasis on the spirit and on the development of teacher spirits as a practical skill that, like, we know what motivates teachers, what keeps them in this very hard work. We know that we've got a crisis in being able to attract teachers to classroom spaces that are challenging, that are asking new things of them in more complicated ways than they have in the past, right? And that if we create spaces in which teachers feel fulfilled, seen, like their work has purpose, they are leading purposeful lives in community with other people who share their values, that they're going to stay in that work longer. Right? So we can think about spiritual development as just purely a practical issue, that if we focus on the spiritual development of the teacher, we are also going to create teachers who persist longer. And for all of us as school heads, as classroom teachers, as parents who want to have some continuity for our own children, that's a valuable economic thing to do, right? But also it's part of this larger understanding of Montessori, like, what is it that we're actually meant to be doing here? And I think when you ask how training is structured, or what we think about in training, why we don't give as much time to spiritual development as we do to understanding the materials, it's because the materials are easier. We know how to do them right. But the spirit stuff, I can't give you in a 10-hour workshop and write off and say, Tamara has finished all of her spiritual development. Now there's a threshold she's passed. And I think as a community, we struggle with the idea of whether or not we know what it's going to look like when it's done well. So I think it ends up being kind of absent from teacher education because we don't really know how to assess it or monitor it. It's a gut thing to know whether you feel as though your own spirits are being invested in, or it's authentic to you. So I think, but when you're in that space that where it is a part of your daily practice, it's a part of the values of your school, you take a different lens towards your own work and your contributions. Your sense that you can be a whole person in the classroom is different. Your ability to be compassionate and empathetic to children, to sit in hard times with each other, is higher. And your ability to persist through hardness in yourself is also higher. So there's like an economic benefit, a practical school administrative benefit to thinking about teacher spiritual development, but there's also our own development in thinking, like, how is this sort of selfish work to do? Because it feels better when we do this work well. But mixed in the middle there is the fact that it's very, very hard. It is much harder than a throwaway workshop, or, let's just go to yoga class on Sunday afternoon and then I've checked off my spiritual growth for this week and I can get back to making sure that all the sandpaper letters are lined up in the right order on the shelf.
I think that is exactly right. And we all love to just get it checked off and be doing it. And yet I think it's the hardest work that we do.
Mm-hmm.
where my spiritual practice personally is so far from perfect and always evolving. Right now, I'm setting a timer and requiring myself to sit, and I really journal it, but my connection with the divine for 15 minutes. And
Mm-hmm.
so that there's that knowing that I'm going into the day with that
Mm-hmm.
preparation. And I want you to know that, like, my mind just goes 17,000 different directions. I
Right.
have to pull it
Mm-hmm.
back and pull it back and pull it back.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that for some folks, that feels like it feels like it's almost an impossible task because
Mm.
they have it that it has to be perfect. Can
Right.
you talk about that a little?
Well, I mean, I want to acknowledge first, like, what a beautiful gift you're giving to yourself to say, this is going to be the time that I allow for this. And it doesn't necessarily have to be even saying, this is my spiritual growth, but do I have a time during the day when I'm giving myself an opportunity to be intentional about my own development? Even if the thing I'm being intentional about is a minute's rest. Right? Like when I was in the classroom, my first practice, and I don't think I even realized at the time that I was creating it as a ritual for myself, was to go pour myself a cup of coffee and sit in the classroom before the children arrived. And I would, I'd sit at a table and I'd sort of look around the room. And there was a part of me that was keeping track of, I need to go get more metal and set paper, or that I need to sharpen these pencils, or I think there's dust in the corner. There was some of it that was an assessment of the space, but it was also a time that was a ritualized time of my day that was about intent. Right. So I think that becomes a pretty useful and self-investing gift, even if your mind is going in 1,000 different directions, because which of us doesn't have, 100,000 different things that are on our head every day. So some of it is just that intention of knowing this matters enough that even on the hard days, even when I don't think I have enough time to give myself a moment of intentionality, I'm still going to do it anyway. I think also knowing that we're doing those things as a part of a community is really important. That if we think about our spiritual development in isolation, that's not actually that's different, right? The Latin root for spirit is the same thing, is the same word as breath. And nobody breathes by themselves. We are sharing this air all of the time. So even in our own spiritual development, you might prioritize it differently, more or less than other people around you. But what you're doing individually is still a part of the communal attention to our spiritual development as well. And I think that's an often overlooked part of it too, that we think about the spiritual growth of teachers as something that they have to go get right. Like we talk a lot about self-care. Have you taken time for self-care? Did you have a lavender bath? Have you gone on a walk? But self-care is limited in what it can do for the fullness of our spiritual growth, because it keeps us isolated from other people. My sense is that spiritual care, or the spiritual development of teachers, the self-care is community care. I think especially for teachers who are wired to come into Montessori classrooms where our work requires us to be so humble that there's something about the Montessori classroom that makes us want to disappear, right? Like we know the greatest sign of the success of a teacher is to be able to say the children are working as though I did not exist. But who is noticing us if our professional life is a place that we're meant to become invisible? And I think that those connections to each other in thinking about our spiritual practices are really necessary to feel fulfilled, especially in a practice that asks us to become invisible.
Dr. Lisa Miller's work talks about how the individual is a third. Really, our spirituality for each individual, they have proven empirical research shows that we are spiritual beings, period,
Mm-hmm.
point, whether or not we believe we are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And 1/3 of that is innate, and
Mm-hmm.
2/3 of it is developed in community, which is
Mm-hmm.
just what you're saying, that
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
actually has to be communal. And yes, we need
Yes.
that time, that the solitude and the silence are ways to access our own spirituality, yet it has to be in community to be cultivated
Mm-hmm.
and to be
Mm-hmm.
seen. And the piece that I want to ask you about is, what is the impact on the children when
Mm.
the adults in the room are a part of that spiritual community?
I think when it's thriving, I'm thinking about a particular school in here in Nashville that does this, that attends to the spiritual growth of its community with so much intentional. intentionality. It's woven into everything that they do. Children are aware of it in the same way that they're aware of our other quirks and foibles in the classroom too. They notice us. We're modeling for them all of the time what we value and who we want to be. Montessori said children become like the things they love. And so if we are in a space in which we're behaving in a way that respects this part of ourselves and allows space for it in each other, children are going to see that and adopt that as a value as well. If we're not doing it, the children are going to see that and adopt that as a value as well. So I think in spaces in which the fullness of our spiritual development is not attended to as an important, proactive thing to care for, if we think about this as a basic human need, if there were any other human need that we had and we knew that we weren't satisfying it, we would expect to see a negative outcome at its absence, right? Like if you're hungry and you're not fed, you're going to experience hunger and you're not going to be at your best self. If you need movement and you don't have the ability to move, you're going to start moving in really difficult ways, right? We see this in the children all of the time. Our bodies we need to have our spirits attended to as well. And if we're not doing that, we see spiritual disruption in the space. I think we've become so comfortable with what that looks like that we think that that's what the norm is. And so there are a lot of things that happen in classroom spaces that are designed to correct the absence of spiritual development rather than to allow for it to thrive. Like we're medicating the spiritual lives of our classrooms through other classroom management techniques. When I believe if we were modeling a holistic spiritual understanding of ourselves as adults and the ways in which we want that to be present in the classroom, we wouldn't have the same kinds of behavioral disruptions in the space, attentional disruptions in the space, and that sort of sense of purposelessness that undermines Montessori's full blossoming.
I have so many questions right now. So many things I want to follow up on. Okay, so I feel like I'm pulsating over here. Okay, so what does it look like? How can you see that? I think you called it the spiritual disruption. What does that look like? How can somebody know if this is a new conversation? You're new to Montessori, maybe your family you didn't grow up with spiritual practices. This is a new conversation for you. You're discovering this new part of yourself, or even you've been in the classroom 25 years and you're deciding whether you're going to stay. What does spiritual disruption look like with children? And then what does it look like when there is a classroom that really has spirituality as a part of their communal and in a non-religious school, right? Like,
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and I think you're hinting at that anyway. We're talking about all of these things inside of not a particular doctrinal way, but like just in a human development way. So I'm gonna step a little bit farther back from the question that you asked, Tamara, to say first, I think it's important to say out loud again what it is that we believe is the nature of children. Because if we want to understand what's disrupted, we have to know what it would have looked like if it wasn't disrupted, right? And as Montessorians, my kind of elevator speech is that we believe children are naturally good. We believe that children are intrinsically motivated to learn. We believe children are intrinsically motivated to contribute to a community that's larger than themselves and that they're naturally peaceful. And those things come together to create all of the other ways in which we structure our classrooms. The lessons that are provided are designed with that sense of their intrinsic motivation to learn as part of what we do. Their ability to rely on each other, the society by cohesion, is because we believe that children want to be a part of a society. Their ability to be self-managing and to be in charge of the classroom wouldn't work if we didn't believe that they were naturally good, right? So these things that are core to what we believe about the nature of children, when we see them not expressing that, that's a spiritual disruption. And in other spaces where maybe the language of spirituality is not as welcome, you will often translate out spiritual development for purpose. And I think it works in the classroom as well. That when you see children engaged in purposeful activity, that's the development of their spirits. When they know that their contribution to the community that they're in means something, that's an expression of their spirit. when they stop and take care of each other, that society by cohesion of noticing when another child is hurt and wanting to be like to leave their own work to go care for another child. That's their spiritual development at work. These things are natural to children. And so in Montessori classrooms, I think we see them emerge when we get out of their way, because I think often the spiritual disruption that happens in the classroom is ours that we've brought in with us. We have a sense that like our work is about the checklists that have to get done. It's about the sequence of materials that we're preparing for a parent-teacher conference, rather than our work is about supporting children in finding their own purposeful work. And so we interrupt their natural ability to stay in that spiritual place, to stay in a purposeful world, because we keep telling them to do other stuff instead. Like, don't worry about what your purpose is, because I've got these 6 math lessons I want you to have mastered by next Tuesday.
Mm.
And I think we bring the disruption in by putting an agenda on children that questions, intrinsically questions their goodness, their ability to contribute to their societies, their intrinsic motivation to learn, and their intrinsic motivation to be a part of a peaceful space. We interrupt that by asking them to be the children that we decided in a room without them even present they should be, who could achieve particular academic standards at a rate that we decided without any observation or knowledge of the actual children in front of us. So if you ask, like, where does the disruption, what does it look like? It's us. We're coming into a classroom space and we are bringing so much other agenda and putting them on these tiny little shoulders that how could a child possibly find or remain in tune with their own spiritual life, with their own sense of purpose, when the messages that they're getting from outside, from their teachers and people that love them, are that you have to be more all the time. Who you are already is not enough. The thing that you wanted to do that would bring you peace and purposefulness is not what I need from you to do today, not what I need you to do today, right? Like, we create the disruption. And so then you see it in classroom spaces where children lose the ability to make choices on their own. They're not as attentive to each other as we think in our philosophy essays they should be. There is more inattention to their own work. The work cycle is disrupted more often. We have to tell them to do things like go choose work, go choose work, go choose work, instead of seeing that natural motivation throughout the day. You know, when it's what it is, to come back to your original question, what I believe the spiritual development of the child is their natural state. Those 4 things: the child is intrinsically good, they're intrinsically motivated to learn, they're intrinsically motivated to contribute to communities larger than themselves, and to be in communities of peace. The disruption is all the things that we see happen in the classrooms when they're not presenting those things. So I think over the last 100 years, 120 years now we're approaching with Montessori, we've allowed ourselves as teachers and as advocates to bring in so much of that agenda into the classroom that we've interfered with children's ability to maintain their spiritual lives. And then again, we're like trying to catch up after they go home to fill those cups for ourselves. Our spiritual growth isn't something that you can do in the rearview mirror. It has to be something that we're preparing for before the children arrive, so that our absence, our deficit, doesn't interfere with their goodness.
Mm. There's a lot there. There's so much good there. I want to
What did
go
I
back
say?
and listen to that a couple of times. Let me ask you this. Do you think that we're finding that children now are coming in, many of them really struggling to have that sense of peace and purpose that even 10 years ago we would see them come in and really connect in the environment and with each other and in this space of love really self-construct and
Yeah.
build those skills. And we're finding that it's harder and that often we have children who are not selecting things that are challenge them because there's a fear there, or there's a they're seeking comfort. There's so much seeking
Mm-hmm.
comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm thinking about that in balance with what you're sharing. Can you speak
Mm-hmm.
about that a bit, of how we meet these little people as they're navigating what they're coming in with, screens during meals,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps not a lot of time ever by themselves being entertained, and it really is such a disservice to the human spirit. Can you speak to that?
Right. Are you surprised by it?
I don't know if I'm surprised. I feel sad. I feel
Yeah.
sad and I feel it keeps me awake at night.
But if you look at your own world as an adult, do you feel more anxious now than you felt 10 years ago? Do you
Ah,
feel like our society is more anxious now than it was 10 years ago?
I think that's it. I think definitely society is more anxious.
No.
100%.
Like the nature of childhood hasn't changed,
Mm.
but what we're making available to them and how much earlier we're making those things available to them, that's definitely changed. The emotional baggage that we have to carry on
Mm.
is coming earlier. But I like when I the courses that I teach when I'm not teaching about Montessori or about the social and political influences on public education, totally different world than when I'm in a Montessori space, except it's not, because in both spaces we are at the only place we could possibly be given the history that we've experienced. And right now, our children are in the only place they could possibly be given the choices that we've made as adults over the last generation. But when we experienced fear over whether or not American schools were doing what they should have been doing, we responded by tightening the ways in which we measure children's value. We created increasingly standardized spaces and expectations for school. When we felt lonely, as we know our society has been moving towards for more than a generation now, we didn't double back and lean into our bowling leagues and fellowship halls. We created social media that distanced us even farther from each other. The solutions we've come up with have made the problems worse. And so children are coming into our classrooms not because their nature has changed or their needs have changed, but because we have further distanced them from the world that is already ready for them, right? Like children need to have time outdoors. They need to have time actually in nature. And over the last 30 years, we've limited and limited and limited the amount of time that's allowed at school. And so school becomes a place that's about busyness and about performance, but not about authenticity, not about purpose, not about being seen. And so by the time that you have a child who's 8 or 9 years old, they very oftentimes have learned that school's not a place that's very welcoming to them. But that infant that you brought home from the hospital didn't feel that. The baby didn't choose not to be welcome. They've lived in a world that has not been welcoming to them. And so it makes perfect sense that they should come into our classrooms asking for a lot of comfort, asking to feel like there are things that they can master. But even a child who's doing work that doesn't appear to be useful to me, if that child is doing it over and over and over again, we see that repetition, we see the drive to stay in that space. Or if a child is engaged in so much social activity that I'm thinking, like, when am I ever going to teach this child how to read? Because I can't get them to stay away from their friends. But there's something about the child's need that is being met through socialization. I can either respond by interrupting the child's need and trying to direct it towards my agenda, or I can figure out how to satisfy the child's need and help them also to do the things that schooling is supposed to do, like teach them how to read and do math and all that kind of good stuff. But if I start from a deficit model about children, if I think about the nature of children now as something I have to fix, then I'm going to continue to add responsibility to the child for correcting my mistakes. And that's like the first thing you learn in Montessori is that if something's going wrong, it's you as a teacher who has to change the environment. It's not the child that has to fix. If I think about the nature of children as still intact and the environment as no longer serving them well, then I'm going to redirect who's responsible for fixing it. So yeah, I think I agree with you. You look at children today and they have so much more to worry about. But they didn't arrive that way. We took our own worries and we handed them to the children and said, like, also, by the way, don't be anxious. we've asked them to carry our anxiety for them, including the anxiety that undermines a sense that there's some kind of performance or achievement that we're all supposed to have done by particular times. You all these benchmarks of how fast are you supposed to learn to read, how quickly should you be able to master the golden bead material, how effectively, how many words. We start counting children's words earlier and earlier and earlier. And that was an intervention that we started by to be able to identify kids who actually had extra supports or needed extra support. But now we think about it as something that we should enhance. Like there's, some magic number of vocabulary words that if a child crosses it, then we know we've done our jobs as teachers. If it's not useful and purposeful to the child, it's not going to support either their own spiritual growth or the things that we say we think Montessori classrooms should do.
So really what you're talking about is that the academic component is actually a support to the spirit.
I think the academic component, when it's chosen by the child because it's purposeful work, but if it's imposed on the child, then it's a disruption. And I think, like when I said in different spaces, I'll use the language of purpose and spirit interchangeably. And I think that's true for us as adults. When we talk about feeling spiritually fulfilled, those oftentimes happen in spaces when we know that we have led lives of purpose. We have had authentic, purposeful connections with other people. We've done things with intentionality. Your choice to sit down and spend 10 minutes journaling or thinking about your day each morning is intention, it's purpose. We feel connected beyond our own bodies when there is a purposefulness to our actions and our choices. When we disrupt children's purposefulness, even when we don't understand what their purpose is, then we've disrupted their spiritual development. And I think there are times in which the academic work inside of Montessori classrooms is exactly what a child is driven by, right? I mean, we've seen that in children who are choosing work, that when they are authentically choosing things for themselves and they feel safe, secured, and loved, they will choose increasingly difficult things to do. They love that challenge. But if it's something that they have to do, if it's our agenda pushed down on top of them, then it's an imposition, not a support.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I really want to chew on that because I think that it's really easy for us to assume we know better. And particularly coming from a place of love where we're committed to the child and their self-development, their their inner discipline, their connection with other students, and so I want to chew on that. I really appreciate that perspective. I think that's really important. And really, I think you're speaking the language that Dr. Montessori originally, this was her work, as she said, follow the child. Follow the child. It was that basic, right? Follow the child. And we've created schedules and we've created expectations and all of this that have, as you said, been imposed. Yes. And is that actually allowing our Montessori movement to do what she initially envisioned?
Right? Because it has been 125 years. Where's the new society, Tamara? Where is it? It's not here yet. The thing that we know how to do really well, when you say we know best, we know how to do these things. The thing that we know how to do is how to create adults just like us. I don't want another generation of highly anxious, self-critical, judgmental, pushing each other away, lonely people. I want to be able to preserve in children the things that they already have, that Montessori reminded us if we got out of the way, we wouldn't steal from them. But the thing that we know how to do well, coming back to that idea of why isn't spiritual development something that takes more of our attention and focus? It's because it's super hard and we don't know what it's going to look like if we actually commit to it. And also, I believe the reason why we haven't seen the new society yet is because we have not actually committed to this. We've been so impressed by the ways in which Montessori is a very effective answer to other philosophers' curricular questions, that we are using Montessori to do traditional education better. Instead of saying wait a minute, that's a dead horse. Why do you want to put a pink tower on the back of a dead horse? It's a dead horse. Walk away from it. We have a different thing that we're supposed to be building. But because we've never seen it, it also takes so much faith for us as adults. It takes so much humility to say, I'm going to commit to this, even though I have never actually seen it work.
Mhm.
And there are none of us that have seen it work all the way to adulthood yet. But I hate to sound pithy about it, but like maybe it's because we just haven't actually tried, right? The like even if you think about the admissions for so many Montessori schools, every people are comfortable sending their kids to Montessori in early childhood when like school doesn't really matter. But sticking around for elementary, staying for adolescence, oh my goodness, going for high school, going to a college that emphasizes the liberal arts, like all of it's an increasingly sharp pyramid of who's at the top of it, because all of the other societal values are real pulls for us. We have a lot of pressure on ourselves to try to get this parenting thing right. And if we do it wrong, it's our children who are going to carry the weight of that. But I think so far what we know is that all the things that Montessori promised us were going to happen have not yet happened. Either Montessori is wrong or we are. And I'm going to take this one to my grave. I don't think she was wrong. I just think she's asked of us something that is so much harder than we thought it was going to be. And there are pieces in this that like Montessori is hard because we have to get out of the way. And how does that work with our own spiritual growth, with our needs to feel purposeful and seen and valuable as adults? That we are in a space where the work that we're called to do is one of becoming increasingly invisible. And if we don't satisfy our human need to be seen in other places, then we're going to keep imposing it on the child in the classroom. And it comes back to that idea, like we have to have communities that are investing in each other's spirits too. That it's not just something we do by ourselves before the children arrive each day, but that we are in communities of care where I know if I make eye contact with you, I ask you how you're doing, I give time in our conversation for thinking, we go take a walk together, we create spaces where there are connections that are real life connections and not just through our phones, that both of us are going to feel seen. We're both going to feel known and in an authentic relationship. And then we're not going to have to ask the children to provide that for us. We're going to be more comfortable stepping out of the way so that what's natural to the child can persist.
You're talking about really a culture of belonging where the
Mm-hmm.
adults have that sense of belonging and feel deeply connected in the community. And part of the
Yes.
work that I've done is actually studying how to develop that in a school because I, early in my career, giving everything I could and wasn't creating it and it just wasn't gelling. And it's pretty remarkable how much intentionality has to go into that specifically, particularly to support educators. Because actually,
Yes.
educators overall, when they're asked kind of what's in the way for them of wanting to stay in the profession, the
Mm-hmm.
majority are answering the administration. Right,
Mm-hmm.
they're not feeling
Mm-hmm.
supported, they're not feeling connected, they're not feeling seen, they're not feeling
Yes.
valued. And I think
Yep.
that's I have never heard that connected with that then impacts how they teach because they're looking to be then seen by the children.
Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating and so
Yeah.
interesting and I think spot on.
Well, I mean, if I were talking about education policy, I would say if you want to understand what a institution values, you follow the money, right? And you see like what do we invest in? What are the things that we say that we demonstrate matter because we actually put the funds behind them. And I think the same thing is true about our communities. You know what you value by what you subsidize. Like what are the things that we make space and time for? And if we don't have space and time as adults to be intentional with each other and to be vulnerable with each other, then we're going to have that meet that someplace else. And my guess is that when we don't have spaces where we feel like it's okay to be vulnerable, we become more controlling. the ability, like if I'm going to learn from you, if I'm going to learn with you, I have to trust you so well to know that who I was before I learned this new thing is something I can discard. I can change my understanding. I can change my knowledge of the world because of what you've brought to me. And that doesn't happen unless I feel safe to change. And, but I think that like in so much of our expectations for teachers in classroom settings, but also for parents are we are expecting people to be more and more performance and assessment driven. When in truth, like that's going to be secondary to being in spaces where we feel known. Because if you want a learning community, you have to have people who feel safe to learn. And that includes the adults, right? Like, I think some of it is also made more challenging in Montessori because we have already demonstrated our revolutionary nature by being willing to be Montessorians, right? There are a lot of easier places to go get a job. We would not have to explain ourselves as much. You can go teach in any school and say, I'm a teacher, but we have to keep tapping on this extra adjective. I'm a Montessori teacher, right? So there is something about people who come to Montessori that knows like we're willing to take a risk and we kind of think we know better. Because if we didn't, we would just be doing what everybody else is doing. It also means, though, that we attract people who are going to have a harder time being vulnerable because there is something about being willing to resist the way that Montessori is an active resistance, that being naming this for ourselves and saying this is part of who we are also means like I want to be good at it. I want to know how to do it well. I think that this is a better way to do it than these other things. There's not a natural softness there. That's not a vulnerable space, but our spirits are actually really tender. And so if we're not in spaces that allow for tender connections between people, we're going to develop thicker skins. We're going to have harder shells between us. I think we've seen that as a community of Montessorians too. Like you probably have people that you just know, like, these are my people. I love them. I want to be with them all the time. I'm going to go to a conference because we're going to spend most of the time in the lobby of the hotel, like flopping on the big couches and just, reminding ourselves of what it felt like to be young. And then there are other people who are like, no, not my Montessori. But all of those lines and delineations are just layers in the shell. They're just separating ourselves from being vulnerable with each other. And if we don't have a space where that's satisfied, it's gonna show in the classroom.
Okay, so here's the big question then.
Okay.
Because up till now, all
I yeah, I appreciate like this has been a pretty shallow conversation.
Let's talk about how we commit to Montessori in an open-hearted, horizon-focused way that makes way for the future while also caring for our own spirits and caring for each other. What does that look like in our schools?
Probably from the end of the sentence backwards to the first, right? Is that we have to be caring for each other first. If we go into our practice as Montessori teachers thinking that we're like, centaurs at the lead of the pack, we're going to be lonely and separated and focused on the wrong things in the classroom. But in our school spaces, especially amongst the communities of we have got to be investing in each other. Because when we're in a space where you notice there's somebody else in the room who has a need, you notice somebody is having a bad day, you're caring for each other, that community care. When we commit to community care, we create communities that care and they care about us too. So the self-care doesn't become like a have to or a thing that I have to schedule in or another way that I can disappoint myself. Self-care becomes something that is fueled and fed by the people who are around us. Our loneliness is held at bay when we create relationships with other people. And we don't want to bring that into the classroom. So, we know like everything else that we do for the children, we prepare before the children get there. And including the spiritual life of the classroom, we have to prepare before the children get there. So I think the end of that sentence first, while we're within these communities of self and community care, that's where we need to put our first attention. And then inside of the classroom, to really believe that the things that Montessori said in her initial observations of children are more important than the outside messages we're getting about what kids should know or be able to perform, how they should be able to perform by particular arbitrary benchmarks. That if you see a child who is engaged in purposeful work, even if you don't understand what the purpose of that work is, you don't disrupt it. You don't get in the way and say, you have to put this away. You've already done this today. Go and choose something else. We have the ability to see a whole lot of things that happen for children if we put away our checklists and take out our observation journals and think differently about what is our work in the space. But most of the work that we're supposed to be doing and creating in supporting this new society that we think the children will be able to create if we get out of their way is because when they're there, we watch them so carefully so that when they're not there, we can prepare for the next time they come back. And I think very often instead, we are so busy doing things in the classroom, making our checklists and making sure that they're meeting the standards of today's society that we have completely forgotten that today's society is not our goal. Our goal is a society we haven't yet seen. And in order for us to get there, we're going to have to look for different benchmarks. We're going to have to look for different torchbearers on our adventures, and they're the children. We can't go down paths that have already been blazed for us because the only place that those paths have taken us is to where we are now. And so if we're looking at the children in front of us and thinking, I already know what this child should know, I need to figure out how to get them to more quickly know it, then they're going to get to where we've already gotten. But if we're going to be looking towards a horizon that we have not yet achieved, where we're going to actually see the creation of a new society, it's because we're going to look at the children very, very differently than we do right now. Coming into a classroom space and being able to observe with that level of reverence and trust for the intrinsic nature of childhood means that before the children have shown up, we have done all of the work to make ourselves prepared to do that. And if you think about our agendas as being a disruption to the child's natural state of being, to the child's natural conditions, then if we haven't done the work to be able to leave those agendas at the door, they're going to follow us right into the classroom and they're going to live on the backs of the children. So the spiritual development for us as adults in community happens outside of the classroom with intentionality so that when we come into that sacred space of the children's house, we can come in with a full reverence to watch what's happening, but not feel as though we have to go mess with it. And I will sort of I'll frame it in terms of a religious space, right? Like we haven't been talking explicitly about religion, but I come from a Catholic background. Montessori did as well. I think there's actually a really lovely metaphor in that when you go into a church setting because you're trying to experience or express gratitude for and a connection to God, you don't walk up onto the altar and start messing around. You watch, you observe, you experience all the beauty that happens when there are 10 or 100 or 500 people in the room looking at the same thing and breathing the same air with the same intentionality. And if we can come into our classroom spaces knowing that the children, to use a potentially problematic word, but the children are ministers of their own lives. They are the pastors of their own path. We're not going to go mess with where they're going. We're going to sit back and watch it with reverence and awe, the way that you watch sunlight come through stained glass. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing if we can get out of their way. But we're only going to get out of their way if we prepare ourselves to get out of their way before they arrive. That happens the same way that all the other things of the prepared environment happen before the children get there, because we've thought about it deeply and invested in it, committed to it, subsidized it as ourselves as adults. Like, this matters enough that it's going to be the thing I take the time to do. And I'm going to do it before the children arrive, the same way that I wash the shelves before they show up. Make sure that the classroom is perfect for them so that who they are can emerge, to make sure I'm also perfectly prepared to be humble. And that happens because I've had my needs for belonging met before the children get there.
So that actually places some of that on the school as a whole for creating an
100%.
environment that is
100%.
prepared
Yes.
for the educators.
Yes.
And then it also means that you as the educator are intentionally, because one of the things that I recognize as I'm a school administrator now is that our community, we actually have professional development every month of the year. We carve out time and part of that is having them have a connection time with each other and 2 times a year, we take that time and we have a party and we connect and we
Mm-hmm.
just like, we're
Mm-hmm.
actually this Friday, we have a happy
Play.
and we're playing and we're karaokeing
Mm-hmm.
and decorating. And
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be really fun. But one of the things that I do actually say to folks as they're coming in is we're going to create a culture of belonging here. And you are still responsible for your mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's something that I think oftentimes people come to the organization looking for us to be able to hold all of it. Can you talk a little bit about
Mm-hmm.
individuals' own responsibility? And that doesn't mean of course, the school, we have to operate. I consider it to be that my job is actually, as the head of school, is to be a Montessori teacher for the school.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
I have to
Yep.
treat everybody with that same respect. I've got to see their
Mm-hmm.
cosmic task. I've got to look to
Mm-hmm.
see where their strengths are. I've got to create opportunities for them to connect with each other. It's got to be safe to be vulnerable. All of those
Mm-hmm.
places, it's got to, and I have to lead with vulnerability. I've got to share my foilables, which I constantly do on purpose so that people know
Mm-hmm.
it's safe to do that, right? So all of those pieces have to be in place. Not that there isn't more to do, always, but
Mm-hmm.
can you talk a little bit about the individual's responsibility to their own mental well-being and
Yeah.
spiritual health?
Well, I mean, and I think if you're putting that same metaphor of you as a head of school as being as thinking about the classroom or about your faculty, the way that Montessori classroom teachers think about their classrooms, the same measure then, right? The greatest sign of success of a teacher is going to be able to say that children are working as though I did not exist. If we're creating structures inside of schools that are administrator dependent, then the analog or the analogy for that in the classroom is classrooms that are teacher dependent, right? So it's not going to work. It's not going to sustain itself long term, and we're not modeling for teachers the trust in them to say, I'm not actually going to infantilize you in a way that tells you what you need. You know what you need. So naming it that it is okay and necessary as a part of the healthy faculty to be attentive to our own mental health, to our own spiritual growth, because those very often are hand in hand. If you say it out loud as a value, you create space for it, but also you recognize that teachers have to do that work themselves in the same way that the child constructs themselves. The adult is still in that process of self-construction. It's not like it stops at age 18, that you're facilitating teachers taking responsibility on their own. And it doesn't mean being punitive to teachers of not meeting a need that you see that's met or that needs to be met, because in the same way that teachers in the classroom with their children, you've got kids at 3 different years in the cycle. You've got children who have all wildly different needs, and you're going to have wildly different needs amongst your faculty as well. But are there ways in which you're asking teachers who do have needs to look to each other as part of their solution, in the same way that a child who is new to the classroom and asks you to help, you might say, have you asked a friend? Or this other person is really good at that. Are you using a teacher who's asking for help? Is that asking a time that you can let them know that it's safe to ask, and also let them know that you trust them to solve it? Or are you taking on responsibility yourself to fix it all the time? But I think it's a maturing of our sense of our own responsibility, to also know that being responsible for each other doesn't mean infantilizing each other. It doesn't. I can be responsible to you without being responsible for you. And that relationship really matters, because if I care for your needs all the time in a way that takes from you the ability to self-care, to name what you want for yourself, or to develop the skills to be self-regulating, to understand what I need to interrupt it before my own mental health becomes an issue. If I'm taking those things from you because I'm doing it on your behalf, it's like tying a child's shoes for them. But it has to be just as individualized as everything else we do in Montessori, which means it's going to be really hard, and we're not necessarily going to be able to say, like, and thank goodness we've got a lot of time on a podcast, because if you ask, none of these are give me your top 3 answers, right? Because they're not about policies, they're about human beings. And human beings are going to be much, much more complicated. And as soon as I tell you this is the way to do it, that person's going to come in your office who presents a new need that, like, never heard of before. And, oh, all right, we got to learn more. Right? It's like, thank goodness we are in a model of being that allows us to keep learning, because, like, This January is the official 30th anniversary of my first year as a teacher. I realized that just a couple weeks ago, and I felt like, man, I don't know what I'm doing. I'd be much more confident about it by now.
Well, and you have your Dr. McTamaney, right?
Yes.
You're well established and lots of letters after your name, and right? You're still in the process of self-construction.
It will be until the day I die. We all will be, right? I mean, that's the path. Yeah. I mean, and I think both like to know that you're constructing and also to know that there are times when like the renovation that you like the addition you put on the back of the house didn't really turn out the way that you thought it was going to, and you got to fix it, right? It's not all self-construction is forward. Sometimes it means taking a minute of retreat and saying, actually, the way that I've been handling this fear, this loneliness, this sense of disconnection from other people, I've been doing it in a way that looked really competent, but actually was undermining who I want to be next. And so I can either continue to build on a faulty foundation, or I can pause and say, I actually have to take a really vulnerable step backwards and address the foundation. I have to go make amends with the people that I've hurt. I've got to go create a better relational setting from which to grow. Like self-construction is throughout our entire lives, but it's not in one direction. It's more like, the path of a bumblebee. And the one thing I will say is I'm very, very grateful that I'm in a community that has been so forgiving, because like that's key to feeling as though it's okay to change. You have to know that you have people who love you. You have to know that you have people who are going to have your back if you fail. And you have to know that you have people who are going to forgive you if you try your best and you did what you thought was best at the time, and then it turns out in retrospect that it wasn't really the thing you should have done. But, like when we offer that to each other, it makes it easier for us to offer it to ourselves. And, like with everything else, it is so much easier to take care of other people than it is to take care of ourselves. It's so much easier to love other people than it is to love ourselves. And it's easier to forgive each other than it is to forgive ourselves. So we have to do it for each other first so that we're safe to offer it back.
And it's building that, and you write about this, that radical love. It's really providing radical love for ourselves
Mm-hmm.
and then
Mm-hmm.
radical love for others. So let's close with that concept.
Yes, yes,
Talk-
yes, yes. Oh, I love that you asked me about that, because it's been something that's been on my brain a lot lately too, because I do think that like, okay, so as I said, I've been teaching for 30 years, and I was traveling in Colombia with my students over for a week in November. And one of the things that my students and I did, I was teaching a class on children's development in the arts, and we were talking about the ways in which arts create a sense of belonging and community. And so we had embedded in this class a week's worth of travel to Bogota and Medellin. And when we were in Medellin, we spent a day with these graffiti artists. The graffiti artists were incredible, because I got to realize like, oh, this thing that I've always thought of as being like, why is there spray paint on that wall? Somebody should paint over that. Like, it looks so disruptive. But the reasons why culturally it allows for a sense of being seen, of known, of knowing what your name is, of seeing your impact on a community. There's actually like this really beautiful identity building that comes through graffiti that I would never have had the opportunity to think differently about. But one of the things that we got to do in this graffiti workshop is that the graffiti artists broke us into little groups for us to like practice tagging stuff. We're learning how to spray paint and like make your own name, and how are you going to write bubble letters and how much harder it is and things like that. It was a day full of so much play and joy. But he said to each of the groups, you should choose a word or phrase that really matters to you. And then as a small collective, decide what you want to do. So I was paired with three of my students. And I wanted them to pick it. I didn't want to intervene and say, like, these are the words I want us to use. So I was just kind of lingering back and listening to their conversation. And one of them said, well, maybe we should do a word that has to do with class. And the other one was like, yeah, I think that's a good idea. And then the third one said, well, then it should be radical love. Oh, like, Summer, my eyes well up to think about it now, because I didn't know that it was okay to do that as the most important thing of my teaching 30 years ago. Like I'm so happy to have gotten enough letters behind the name to say, actually, like the way that I've been teaching for a really long time is not the way I want to teach. And I can do this as an authentic person who doesn't have to have the fear of like, am I doing it right? Because I've already demonstrated, like, I know how to do that part. I can do that, but I don't want to do it that way. I want to do it in this other way instead. I want to be in a space that is filled with radical love. And radical, the way that we think about it mathematically, as foundational, down at the root, is everything that I'm doing coming from a place of love. And if it is, then these other things fall into place. But the lesson that I took away from that, from being with my students, was that recognition that, like, I would never have had the courage to teach the way that I had been that I'm teaching now, if I hadn't gotten through a whole lot of messy of knowing that being in charge and controlling didn't work. I didn't fix the outcome by thinking that I knew what it was going to be and that I could manipulate my students towards getting there. They were still messy and complicated, and they had these big lives, and they had parts of themselves that I was never going to be able to see. And other human beings, of my students or my colleagues, are not things for me to fix. And thank goodness I got to a point professionally that I could say, what if I do it really differently? Because who knows, like, this might get back to my administrators. Maybe I'm not going to have a job next year, but it's okay. That's fine. Because if the thing I go out on is the idea that my students know the most important thing about my classroom is radical love, I'll take that. I'll take that, you know, but it's not something you check off on a list. You have to have known that being controlling didn't work to get to a place where my first motivation isn't going to be doing it right. My first motivation is going to be doing it lovingly. And like, that's what, like, when you lean into that as the purpose of your work, the work changes in ways that are so quickly visible, and that people feel seen and known and connected to. Like, you know, they want to show up for each other when they know that the thing that connects us is that foundational, at our root, we're going to behave in a way that comes from love. It's like, it's easy to do that with 2-year-olds. It's so hard to do that with adults. But adults, as it turns out, respond exactly the same way if you offer it to them.
That's right.
They
That's right.
create these, like, beautiful, joyful, childlike communities of joy, of play, and, like, you know, they have each other's back. They create societies by cohesion when you lead with love with them too. You know, for each other, for them, for what they can build out in each other, and for also knowing that it's okay to love them. That, like, the demonstration of love is a way of loving ourselves too.
Mm. That is the perfect note to end on. I mean, radical love. It's the foundation
Mm.
of every single thing that really Montessori believed in, and certainly is foundational to our work. I
Mm-hmm.
so appreciate you, Catherine. I thank you for taking time with us today. I so hope you'll come back, because I could spend 7 more hours talking to you. There was so much that you gave us today. Just thank you for your work. Thank you for your commitment to Montessori. Thank you for doing the work to have the letters behind your name so that you
Mm-hmm.
can speak these truths and let them resonate for the world. Thank you for the books you've written. Thank you for the, I think it's called New Teacher, Wise Spirit. Am I getting that right?
Why Spirit New Teacher, the one for AMS.
For
Yep. And
AMS.
then, yep. And then Only Poets and Little Children is the one that came out this past summer.
Oh, and Only Poets and Little Children. I haven't read that one yet. I'm gonna
It's
get it on.
another Montessori quote. It all comes back to Montessori too, right? Thank you. It's just, what a joy. I was having a really crummy morning, and then you gave me an opportunity to, like, sit down and talk about love and children and forgiveness and grace. And now I'm going to have a great day. So thank you. You know, we make space for things, and then beautiful things happen. That's a good lesson to leave.
I'm so profoundly grateful, and grateful to you too, to our listeners. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Take a look at our website at greenspringcenter.org to view the show notes from today's episode, and a link to Catherine's website is included on the show notes page of our website, and you can learn more about her and her important work there. We invite you to subscribe to our podcast to hear the latest episodes. As Dr. Montessori said, an education capable of saving humanity is no small undertaking.
Mm.
We're in this together. The work you do is the most important work, and we're here to help. Join us next time.